Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We are live on YouTube as well as here on a Zoom webinar with Molly Fisk. Some points of order before we get started. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A if you're with us in Zoom. Otherwise, if you could put them in the chat on YouTube, I'll keep an eye on both for us and share them with Molly if anything comes up. And so without further ado, let me introduce Molly Fisk. So Molly is the inaugural Poet Laureate of Nevada County and has edited California Fire and Water, a climate crisis anthology with a Poets Laureate Fellowship from the I cannot pronounce that, Academy of American Poets. She is the author of The More Difficult Beauty, Listening to Winter, and Houston, We Have a Possum, among other books, and has won grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, the California Arts Council, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Molly lives in the Sierra Foothills, where she teaches writing to cancer patients, provides weekly commentary to community radio, and works as a radical life coach. We are honored to have her join us today. Welcome, Molly, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much. The Academy of American Poets. It is a big mouthful. It's a great organization too. Hi everybody, I can't see you and I have no idea who's there. And this is one of the out-of-body type of experiences that Zoom provides us with. So I'm going to read you some poems from this anthology, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how to make an anthology in case anybody's interested, or in case you yourself are a poet who's been submitting and don't know how the process works. And if I seem a little strange, which I might, it's just the disembodied aspect of doing this and looking at my own self talking on my own screen and seeing my cats outside running around. But here we go. I'm starting with the poem This Time by Claire Blotter from California Fire and Water. All you have to do is read, hear dried crackling grasses, now, before they burst into golden, merciless flames. Then gather your box of important papers, pets, devices, and head for open space before trees, buildings crash down and around you, thinking this is a movie, really, a drama, a dream, but it's life now, your life on this flooded, burning planet. So many crowded together, flaming, floating loose, inside from anger, greed, and pride. And this time we will not escape suddenly. This time we must hear each other or die. The poem, Claire Blotter is an adult. The poem is full of spaces between the words, which is why I was reading it in that particular fashion. The story about this grant is, about this anthology, is that when I was Poet Laureate of Nevada County in 2018 and 19, I found out about a grant and I applied for it and I got it. There's a longer story that I'll tell you in a minute. And the project involved teaching and producing an anthology of poems that had been written by students in classrooms by adults all around California. And then setting up readings for everybody to do. We had scheduled 20 readings for April 2020, which is National Poetry Month. And you know what happened then. Everything got shut down and things became not impersonal, but unable to be done in person. And after having worked my tail off for months to get this to happen, I sort of fell over, as many of us did at the beginning of the pandemic. And I am now standing up again and putting forth this book and sending it into the world. So I'm delighted that the library wanted to have me come and talk a little bit about what the process is like. So I'm not sure how many of you know what anthologies actually are. It's a question that I've been getting from different directions. An anthology is any group of a particular kind of writing. So in this case, it's an anthology of poems, but there are anthologies of essays and fiction and nonfiction, short stories, and all kinds of different things. There are anthologies. There's a really wonderful group of them just come out. One is called African American Poetry, 250 Years of Struggle and Song, edited by Kevin Young, who is now the, among many other jobs he has, he's the poetry editor of The New Yorker. And there's also recently out, When the Light of the World Was Subdued, Our Songs Came Through, is an anthology of Native American poetry edited by our current US Poet Laureate, Joy Harjo. I have followed for years since it came out, which was, I think, in 95, maybe 94. Carolyn Forche put together an anthology of incredible poems called Against Forgetting, 20th Century Poetry of Witness. And as someone who started out teaching people who'd been traumatized, that book, though it wasn't about domestic violence, was incredibly helpful to people who had been undergoing both domestic violence and other kinds of social violence, even though it is mostly about wars and larger formats for violence. It really was transferable. One of the things I want to say about anthologies is they are so, it's such a wonderful thing. I mean, it's wonderful to read a book by a particular person and see what kind of work they're doing and what their subjects are. And if you love somebody's work, like Robert Frost or Mary Oliver or Kevin Young or whoever it is, it's great to see all those poems together. But there's something equally fabulous about seeing all kinds of different voices where, hello, Sid, this is my very old cat, where you get a real sense of perspective and the differences in how poems can be made. It's wonderful for learning more about poetry, and it's wonderful for teachers because we can say, you know, you can write a sonnet like this, or you can write a sonnet like that, or you don't have to write a sonnet at all. And it's taught me an enormous amount just to be reading different anthologies. So I vote for that as something, if you're exploring poetry or if you're exploring teaching poetry, to go find books. And there are all kinds of anthologies. There are poems about driving, there are poems about schools, anthologies about driving and anthologies about schools. There's something called the Best American Poetry of Any Particular Year. And first of all, many of us go through there to see who got in and who didn't, and we are the ones who didn't, so we're sort of thinking about that. And it's also poems from around the country, from all kinds of different people. And it's interesting, the variety is interesting, sometimes the lack of variety can be interesting. So there are things to say about how anthologies get put together, that everybody has different ideas about what should be in them and different standards. And to some extent, it's who you know and who you've heard of. The Best American anthologies are put together from poems that came out in magazines during the prior year. So if you haven't written any poems or gotten them into any magazines, you're not going to be included in that or even looked at to be included. So there are always things going on about who's where. I just think it's really interesting to have the breadth of variety when you're looking at any art form. I mean, it would be like seeing a gallery show with 200 artists in it. You know, it's going to be fascinating in a lot of ways. Sid, are you fascinated? I don't know if these cats like poetry, but they hear a lot of poetry because I always read aloud to them to see how it sounds out in the air. There are also smaller instances of anthologies, and one of the ones that I came across, because I used to work for California Poets in the Schools, they did an annual statewide anthology of poems that were written by the kids in their classrooms, and then there were also teacher poems included in those anthologies. And when I worked for them for about 12 years as a teacher in schools. And I ended up editing 3 of their annual anthologies. So my prior experience, besides teaching from anthologies, was editing those kinds of things. And I think I wrote the foreword for one of them also. What you want with an anthology is a good subject, and then a bunch of good poems, and then someone to write a foreword for it, and also for you, the editor, to do a little bit of talking about why you did this and what was going on. I'm going to move to another poem right now. I'm going to sprinkle poems through this talk. And this is by Muad Belkafia, who's a 4th grader, last year was a 4th grader at the Cleveland Elementary School in Oakland. But now to fire. Once I was the mist in the clouds. I was the one drop of rain. But now I am the storm. But now to fire. But now to smoke. Brief and specific. Now I'm going to read you another one, conveniently written by me, although I seem to have lost it. This is the thing, I hate it when other people do when you're at a reading. But I have to remind you that I'm a very, very last minute sort of a person. Sid can tell you that's true because of the dinner time shenanigans that happen around here. So I put together my poems that I was going to read to you just about 45 minutes ago, and I clearly forgot to mark my own. This is called Particulate Matter. If all you counted were tires on the cars left in driveways and stranded beside the roads, melted dashboards and taillights, oil pans, window glass, seatbelt clasps, the propane tanks in everyone's yards, though we didn't hear them explode, R13 insulation, paint inside and out, the liquor store's big letters in puddled colors below their name. Each man made so every shoe in all those closets, the laundromat's washers' round metal doors. But then Arco, Safeway, Walgreens, the library, everything they contained. How many miles of electrical wire and PVC pipe swirling into the once blue sky? How many linoleum acres? Not to mention the valley oaks, the ponderosas, all the wild hearts and all the tame, their bark and leaves and hooves and hair and bones, their final cries. And our neighbors, so many particular, precious, irreplaceable lives that despite ourselves, we're inhaling. As many of you know, the Paradise Fire was very near us, and I wrote that maybe a week after the fire had started. And I sent it to a place where poems are immediately published within the week that you wrote them and within the week of whatever it is you're writing about happened. And that poem got chosen as the poem for that week and also was taken and moved around. It wasn't what I would call viral exactly, but it was as viral as I've ever gotten. So a lot of people saw that poem. And I've had people responding to that poem and then finding out about the anthology. So California Fire and Water is being discussed by some French communication students in Paris after I did a little interview with them last week. And, you know, fire is on everybody's mind and climate crisis is on everybody's mind. So it's a good thing to have these issues spread around. And that's another benefit of an anthology. I've gotten people have said to me, I've heard about the fires in California, people who don't live around here. I've heard about the fires in California. I've seen the clips on TV. It's terrifying. And at the same time, it's part of the news cycle. And so there's a way that it's not real. But your book, this book of poems, has helped me feel it, has helped me feel what it might be like in all kinds of different ways, to lose your house, to not lose your house, you know, to be under all this smoke, even though there's no fire that's near you. So it's a pretty good way to show people what things are like here who aren't here experiencing them. And as for all anthologies, I think that's one of the big purposes of them, is to help everybody else understand what's going on where you are. So I wrote down a little bit, I'm looking at my notes, and I wrote down some stuff about how this all happened. So I'll tell you the story briefly, but if you've got questions at any point, I don't know how you're supposed to do it, write it in the chat or say it somewhere, and Megan will help me find out what you're saying, and then I will answer the questions if I can. So I've told you that I'm sort of a late reactor or a last minute person. In the second month to go before my poet laureateship for Nevada County was over, I found out about a new grant for Poets Laureate that was being offered by the Academy of American Poets in New York City. And they're the people that run poets.org. They started National Poetry Month. They've been supporting poets for decades in lots of different kinds of ways. And they had gotten a grant from the Mellon Foundation. And the thing to remember about the Mellon Foundation, which is, first of all, they have a lot of money and they give it out to arts organizations as well as other places. Elizabeth Alexander, the poet who was Barack Obama's inaugural poet, and let's just have a little hooray for the circumstances of our presidential election. Elizabeth Alexander was hired to head the Mellon Foundation. So you can see that benefits to poets were going to trickle down from that idea. And she did, in fact, I don't know who exactly put this together, but the people at the Academy of American Poets and the people at the Mellon Foundation hatched this plan to support Poets Laureate. A poet laureate it's an old idea from, 1502 or something, where kings, mostly kings, a few queens, but mostly kings, wanted someone who could commemorate in verse wonderful things that had happened, and probably it's like marketing a little bit, sort of support their good deeds if they had any, or their great successes in conquering other countries. So originally the poet laureate was someone who worked for a court, and that devolved into someone who worked for a country. England has had poets laureate for years. In the current day, we've had poets laureate of states. And I'm not sure exactly when the idea came along to sort of spread the wealth, but Poets Laureate, when I first started writing, which was in 1991, there were Poets Laureate here and there. In California, there was a state poet laureate. There was one for the country, although it wasn't called a poet laureate. It was called something to do with the Library of Congress. It had a different name, and people held the post for 10 years or 20 years. Anyway, by the time I came along to Nevada County and became the poet laureate of the county, I was the first one. Many, many counties in California and around the country had poets laureate. A lot of cities did, a lot of the states did, not all of them, but lots. And the job, which sometimes is a paying job and sometimes is not, is to sort of be a representative if something big happens during your tenure. The idea is that you would write about that and in some way either commemorate it or provide something to people to think about. I'm thinking about Billy Collins was the US Poet Laureate when 9/11 happened in 2001, and he wrote a poem about that. a lot of other people wrote poems about that. They're amazing poems about that event. Anyway, the job is a civic type of job. You're not just writing about whatever you feel like, although you certainly can merge whatever you feel like with what's going on in your area and make something happen. Anyway, a lot of poets laureate are working pretty hard to bring more poetry to their county or jurisdiction, whatever it is, and almost never getting anything in terms of recognition for how much work that takes. And I think that there's a way that poets do a lot of work for poetry. It's kind of part of the job because poetry's been so marginalized. You don't get paid much for individual poems when you publish them. You don't get paid much for your books. You certainly don't get advances for poetry books. So there's a way that poetry has moved into a kind of a gift-giving economy. And under that idea, it makes sense that we would do things without getting paid in honor of and to further our art. On the one hand, that's great. And I think gift giving is a great type of economy to have. On the other hand, many of us have rent, mortgages, and other things. Some of us have to buy cat food. So it's a little dicey in terms of being this kind of artist and then trying to survive. So it was really unusual and really wonderful to hear that there was a grant for Poets Laureate. And I found out about it late in the game, but it had just been invented. So I wasn't late in that way. I applied late because I'm that sort of a girl. And I got a lot of help from Eliza Tudor, the head of our Nevada County Arts Council, and a couple of other friends. I needed and stuff. But first, when I first heard about the grant, it included, you could be the poet laureate of a state, a city, a town, a nation. You could be the poet laureate of a Native American nation, and they had left out counties. And I, and you, and many of us who are here think of our county as the real unit. We like Nevada City and Grass Valley and Truckee, but the county is the operating unit, partly because we're also spread out and it's such a rural place. So being me, I immediately fired off an email to the organizers of this grant and said, excuse me, are we chopped liver here in the counties? And I think I counted for them how many county poets laureate there were in California, and I can't remember that number, but it was something like 45. There were lots and lots of county poets laureate. And I thought, nice try, but this is going to happen next year. They're going to change it to include counties, and next year I won't be the poet laureate, so that's that. And I waltzed off into my life. And then I got an email back saying, oh my gosh, we didn't mean to forget you. We want to include you. And so here is the new language, which includes the word counties. And I got this in an email, and I was checking my email at the SPD parking lot. And I thought, oh darn. Actually, I didn't think darn. I thought a different word from darn, but we'll see this as a public forum, and I'll try not to swear. And I was standing next to my car, and I suddenly, you know how it is, sometimes your brain just makes a little flower out of everything. One of the requirements for the grant was that they wanted to reach out to youth. And one of the requirements was that they wanted to make sure that the projects were aimed at the concerns of the county or the jurisdiction. So I stood there in the SPD parking lot and I thought, well, for heaven's sakes, if a person were going to write a grant for this, under these circumstances, what you would do is obviously send poets out into schools to help kids write about how bad this is, how bad the fires are, how scary it all is. What is it like to have your town burned down? This was about a year after the Paradise Fire had happened that I was looking at the grant. And then I said to myself, and of course, if you're going to do that, you would use California Poets in the Schools, which is an organization that already sends teachers to teach kids everything. You just give them a little sort of 5-session curriculum about climate crisis, which at the time we called climate change. And then I thought to myself, you're trying to reach as many people as possible, so you'd make an anthology out of those poems. And, kid poems are interesting, but you would probably want adult poems in there also, just to make it more balanced to appeal to more people. And then what are you going to do to reach out to more people? I kept thinking of the expansion part of this. If you have an anthology, you're going to do readings from it, because that's what people do with anthologies, is read in public. And I thought, this was in the course of about 3 minutes that all this happened in my brain. If you're going to have readings, then you'd want to have lots of them. Nevada County is a little bit small and a little bit white for large statements about anything. And we did not at the time, and we still do not have a state poet laureate of California. So I kind of elbowed my way into doing a statewide project, even though I was the Nevada County Poet Laureate. So I thought, next year it's going to be 2020. April is National Poetry Month. Let's do 20 readings, because of how synchronous that looks, all over the state from the anthology, and that will be fun. And that's the project I would think up, I said to myself in the SPD parking lot. And then I went home and forgot about it. I didn't forget entirely. Got a hold of the person who's now the head of California Poets in the School. So clearly I was thinking about this before I came late. And okay, how many teachers would we have? If I were going to make a budget that included a bunch of teachers, paying a bunch of teachers, how much money would I need? So I spoke to her, and she told me how many poets that were working for California Poets in the Schools. And then she told me how many poets were likely to take this on, which was not the same number. And I filed that away. And then the deadline was on Sunday afternoon of some Sunday, I can't remember. And Friday, I decided to apply for the grant. And I did, and I got help with the letters, and I figured out the math and how much money I would need. The other thing that I'm experienced with is making my own books, which is to say, finding a good designer for the cover and finding a good person to do what's called desktopping, which is not a word, putting together all the material inside the book so it looks like a book and the pages are the right size and everything. Not just because I had produced the anthologies for California Poets in the Schools, which were in the late 90s, but also I'd produced 4 books of my own of radio essays from KVMR. So I had a bunch of experience understanding how much all that cost, who to talk to. And I had a fabulous cover designer who is in fact a poet in our county and has a poem in the anthology, Maxima Khan. She had done all my small book covers. The person who'd done the insides had just retired, and he did one more book for me after he retired. But when I asked him about this, he said, no, sorry, forget it. I am really retired. So that was a big kind of hole in the process where I didn't know how I was going to fill that. Luckily for us all, there's another poet in Nevada County who runs a desktopping company, and her name is Julie Valin. So it started to feel like me and my friends were going to have fun. I should probably mention that I did get the grant. So at some point, after having costed all this stuff out and sent you have to send in your plan in a short speech and then your plan in a longer speech, and then you have to send in a budget. And it was a little confusing. I sort of hate to admit this because it makes me seem so stupid, but the money they kept talking about was a little bit confusing because they said that you needed to have a project of a certain amount. And my project was $31,000 to hire the teachers, to get everybody to do all this work, to produce the books, to put the readings on, all that stuff. And yet the grants were not in the same range as the project. And I didn't understand that some of the money they were going to give people was to support their own writing. So when I did get the grant, and I was one of 13 poets laureate in the country to get the grant, it was their first year, as I've probably made clear. And they've now done a second year with more people. It's pretty amazing. Anyway, I was in the first group, which I will not call a cohort, which is a silly way to use the word cohort. Now you're getting all my opinions. I was the only person from a county, and I was the only person with a climate crisis, which we changed the word from change to crisis, project. So every time I started to feel, and this was, I'm afraid, fairly often, as though I was a has-been, unorganized, always almost late poet from a rural place that was very white, probably not have gotten a grant, I consoled myself by saying, "Who else is talking about climate crisis, and someone has to do this, and I'm doing it, so there." That's how I fight my demons. I often have to say "so there" to them. Let me read you another poem. I'm burbling on here. Some of the poems in the book, like this one by Jane Hirschfield, I had seen before, and I went to Jane and asked her for this particular poem. And she said yes. And so one reason this anthology, I think, is as rich as it is that I've been a California poet since 1991. And I knew all these people who are now quite famous when they weren't quite so famous. So part of what works, as with everything, is who is it that you know, and how can you get a hold of people you don't know? Like Juan Felipe Herrera, I solicited a poem from him as well. And at the time he was our US Poet Laureate. And I don't know him, but I know people who do know him. So he knows, I could introduce myself and make that connection. I would say, I think 7 or 8 poems in the book of 145 poems, I actually asked the poet for, just FYI. And the rest were submissions either from teachers or from adults in California. Let them not say, we did not see it. We saw. Let them not say we did not hear it. We heard. Let them not say they did not taste it. We ate. We trembled. Let them not say it was not spoken, not written. We spoke. We witnessed with voices and hands. Let them not say they did nothing. We did not enough. Let them say, as they must say something, a kerosene beauty, it burned. Let them say we warmed ourselves by it, read by its light, praised, and it burned. Now I have goosebumps all the way up my back. You might not have goosebumps. People respond to poetry really differently. So I'm going to read another one. Yes. This is Finley Robinson's Melted Silk. And he was last year a 5th grader from the Park School in Mill Valley, a place where when I was in high school, I used to take folk dancing lessons, just FYI. Melted Silk. Oh, water, you trickle and drip down the slimy, smooth rocks. You splash and crash into a pool for a bright orange fox. Oh, water, the waves you create are the things that keep surfers out late. Oh, water, you weave the mist out over the land as waves bubble and crash against the sand. Oh, water, you rush all your deep blue sadness down. It wears away and floods a tiny little town. Oh, water, you slip through clouds' grasp and fall. You drip, drip down and splash over all. Wet, drizzle, overflow, tides, puddle, undertow. That is really fun to read. And if you have the book ever someday, it is on page 140. What else shall I tell you? Does anybody have any questions yet? It's always great if you have a question. You can make up a question. You don't even have to really have it. You can just be helping the process of this talk by bringing in some sort of question. So one of the things about anthologies is it's a bunch of poems. It's a group. And one of the things about a group is it's possible to have different kinds of groups. And as you know, Nevada County is very white. And we are rural and we are northern. And this was a book, I really did kind of steal the attitude of a state poet laureate for the whole state of California. And I thought we need to have racial diversity. We need to have a wide gender orientation. We need to have this be as fair and as equal as possible. We need to have geographic spread. We need to have city versus rural spread. We need to have adults versus children, a balancing act of all these different kinds of things. We need to have some famous poets to make the book seem like it's a legitimately good book and will appeal to a wider audience. And we need to have people that no one has ever heard of with good poems, because that's part of what an anthology does, is to kind of carry the whole group up to a higher place. I can't remember. So I got a hold of 4 other people to help me be editing the poems that came in that were submitted by both the teachers of kid poems and the adults. So Kirsten Casey and Julie Valin and Chris Olander and Lisa Alvarez all helped choose poems. And I got a last look at everything and did a little bit of rearranging in terms of saying yes and no, mostly saying yes to things that were maybes in the voices of other people. I mean, in the, what's it called, opinions of other editors. Because being the main editor, you get to have your way in lots of ways. I had to turn some of my friends down. I got turned down by a couple of people whose poems I really wanted. Forrest Gander had been really immediately just before I got the grant, like 3 days before I got the grant, we had the Sierra Poetry Festival, and Forrest Gander was the keynote poet, and he read a poem about fire that I thought was amazing. So I called him up and asked for it, and he said no. And that was interesting because he said no because he doesn't let poems out of his hands for about a year after he's written them. And it had not been a year, it had been a couple of months since he'd written that one. And even though he was reading it in public to sort of show, a lot of us do this, is read something that's not quite done yet in public to see if it works or not. You find out interesting things when you're in that kind of formal situation. He also was coming out with it in a book fairly soon after his year was going to be up, and he didn't want to have anybody else scoop him, I believe. That's my memory of this. Anyway, I don't like to be turned down, so that felt very bad. But only for about 15 minutes. And then it was kind of like, okay, I understand. And I was fascinated, since I tend to send my poems out the door long before they're actually finished. It was interesting to hear someone who holds on to them for a year. I was like, wow, we are different people, aren't we? I really wanted Maxine Hong Kingston to write the foreword, even though she's not a poet, because she's meant so much to me, and because she was such an early person on the writing scene in my experience who wasn't white. I wanted Brenda Hillman. So there's a couple, Bob Hass and Brenda Hillman, who are both famous poets, but Bob is famouser. And I wanted Brenda to have more limelight. And so I both asked her for a line which we use in the as one of the sort of dedication lines. And I also wanted one of her poems. And I on purpose did not ask Bob, even though I adore him, because I really wanted Brenda to shine. And it turns out there's a little corollary to that, which happened, which is after I made the anthology, I sent it out to lots of people. I sent 4 copies to Gavin Newsom and his wife so they could keep one each and then give some away. I sent them to all our senators and politicians and whatnot, not what's his name, but I sent them to the people whom I admire in the political arena. And I sent them to some editors of magazines whom I really love and who have accepted my work, and I have relationships with them. And one of those people is a man. And he wrote back, and I guess he's made some anthologies, which I don't think I knew. But he wrote back with great distress that there were more women in this anthology than men. And I didn't say this to him, but what I thought was, how do you like it when that happens? How does that feel for you? And no blame on him in particular at all, except that he's white and male and my age or older. I hadn't even thought to balance men and women, because men are always more so in all the poetry places that I go and look. And it actually just didn't occur to me. And so that turned out to be pretty funny. I believe they're about, I can't remember the numbers right now. I should have looked that up. But I think they're about 35% men and the rest are women. And I think that's totally fine. As Ruth Bader Ginsburg liked to say, there will be enough women on the Supreme Court when there are 9. Don't get me started on it. All of this stuff. Sid, I'm so sorry. I'm being political. I didn't get Maxine Hong Kingston to do the foreword, but I found a wonderful writer whom I didn't know before named S.A. Smythe. And they are a writer in Southern California, a professor working a lot on Black diaspora writing around the Mediterranean. They were coming from a place that I had not ever been myself. And so that was really nice to find somebody to enrich the book in that way. I would like to read you another poem, but the cat is sitting on the book, so we have to disturb him a little. Of course, I wanted to have our own famous person in town. Gary Snyder put a poem in this book, and so I asked him for this one, which is called Control Burn, and it's from, I can't remember which book it's from, but it's from one of his earlier books. Control Burn. What the Indians here used to do was to burn out the brush every year, in the woods, up the gorges, keeping the oak and the pine stands tall and clear, with grasses and kitkadizzy under them. Never enough fuel there that a fire could crown. Now, manzanita, a fine bush in its right, crowds up under the new trees, mixed up with logging slash, and a fire can wipe out all. Fire is an old story. I would like, with a sense of helpful order, with respect for laws of nature, to help my land with a burn, a hot, clean burn. Manzanita seeds will only open after a fire passes over, or once passed through a bear. And then it would be more like when it belonged to the Indians before. Sid is purring along, and also now, hold on, sitting on my notes. These Zoom calls are very entertaining as far as families and animals go. You're not asking any questions that I can hear, so I'm just going to keep going. It's about 1:45. So some anthologies you can put together and make make a shape from the poems as you read the poems. So as you're thinking about what the book should be, you put the poems in a particular order to make it sound the way you want it. That takes a huge amount of time, in my experience of having done it with my own books, trying to take my own poems and make some sort of shape and flow and arc and all that stuff out of them. So, I was really stuck for time. The one glitch in the project was that the kids, I got the grant so late in the spring, they couldn't teach the kids that year. They had to use the fall semester to teach them. And then I had to get the book made in time for poets who were in it to have a copy to read in their hands in April. So that's pretty tight to receive all the poems. I think I asked for them by December 1st. And then we ran through choosing them, editing things, getting the book, the text in the right place. I can't remember, Julie and I, poor Julie, I kept finding mistakes. There were a lot of mistakes in this book. I'll tell you about that in a second. And I haven't worked so hard since I was in graduate school to get something done around, of a professional nature. I'm usually a little bit better at making my time accommodate my life, which is to say not having to work too hard. Now I need this piece of paper again. Thank you. So I didn't do some things I should have done. One is I should have had a proofreader, and several people offered to proofread, but there just wasn't going to be time. I mean, I could have given them a day to read the whole book, but I didn't have time. That wouldn't have been enough time for them. And I didn't have time to even add one more thing to my list of what was going to happen. So I relied on myself for proofreading, which was really stupid. And we had many fascinating mistakes, some of them punctuational and some of them textual and spelling wise. We had a few, but there were two rather dramatic ones. One was that I put in only half of one poem for somebody. And I think she found that out when she actually read the book and then called and told me. And then I left out an entire poem of somebody else. She was not in the table of contents, or her poem was not in the book itself, but her bio was in there. So it's like, I mean, this is why one has a publishing house. So you have many more people to catch all the mistakes. Although, having said that, my first book of poems was printed. Many copies were printed without any page numbers in the table of contents. So maybe this is just me carrying on some sort of tradition. I don't know. So we put the poems in alphabetical order, and that made things much simpler for me. And also, people can't really get mad at you. People can get mad at you for a lot of different reasons. They aren't in the book, or you've spelled their name wrong, or whatever. And many of those things you can accommodate. Order, people can get mad at you about where they are in books. And so the alphabet is your friend in terms of an anthology, in my opinion. Or chronology is good too. When Carolyn Forche did Against Forgetting, it's pretty much chronological. So if you're going to make an anthology, you need to find your cover designer and your text desktop publishing person. You need a cover photo. And I fell in love with a cover photo in August. And I wrote to the person who had taken the photo. It's of a California fire, and it's, wait a minute, I can show you. It's of a California fire, and it's also, I don't know if you can actually tell this if you're not looking closely, but this part is Bass Lake, which is reflecting the fire. And the photographer is named Darvin Atkinson. He lives in Bass Lake, the town, and he took this photo of a different fire, whose name I'm forgetting, from 2014. So, but it was really flung around the internet, and that's where I saw it during the fire season of 2018. because it's such a beautiful photograph and it's so horrible to see. So I wrote to him and asked if I could use the photo for the flyer announcing that we wanted submissions. And he said yes. And he said, I don't do this for a living, but I need to make money from it. So tell me how much you'd like to pay. And I can't remember what I said, but it wasn't a lot of money, but it was decent. I think it was $50, which for the use of a photograph is kind of unheard of, but it was person to person in a way that I love. And then I had a different photograph that I wanted to use for the cover, and that is beautiful, but it wasn't the right shape or size or colors or anything for the cover. And luckily, I have been saved several times by my friends, many times, but in particular, twice in really huge ways by my friend Max, who did the cover, Maxima Khan. And she said, no, this is the cover. Really, think about this again. And so I did. And we played around with colors. And, when you make a cover, there's a lot going on. You have to think about the typeface and is there room and how crowded and are the edges big enough so the printing can happen without drastic mistakes and stuff like that. I've published my books through Ingram, which is a distributing company that started its own publication, print-on-demand arm. And the reason I chose them is that if you are produced by them, they also put you in their distribution catalog, which is a place you want to be. So I knew I was going to go with them. It's not hard. None of this is hard. If you know what you want and you have any money to do it with. The money part is always a problem. I think to actually do my own little radio books, it's cost about, I started at about $600, and then 4 years later it was about $800 to produce the book. And then all you pay for is the copies later, which tend to run about $5 a piece. So if you have some money up front to pay those costs, you can make some money if your book sells. Part of the other aspect of self-publishing, don't bite me. Dinner time is at 4. One of the things you have to do is market your work, market the book. And that's an enormous amount of work. And even though now you have to market your book if you get a regular publisher, you still have to market it much more if you're self-publishing. In this case, I had a grant, so I didn't have to worry about the money, but the pricing came in pretty much the same. The book's a little bit bigger. It's both size-wise, it's taller and wider, and it's also got more in it than my radio books have. But it was still under $1,000 to produce the book. And because there was a grant involved, I didn't have to raise that money, which was nice. And then also, I can sell the book. And what I do with the money, I'm giving some of the money from the books back to the Nisenan here, on whose unceded land I live and work. That's part of my trajectory for this project, is to support them a little bit. And then I'm also supporting the money that I make from the book is also going to produce more books that I will give to libraries in California, state libraries, public libraries and school libraries and prison libraries. So I'm trying to make this, I'm trying to work inside a circle of information and benevolence. But a lot of it is about, we need to think about climate crisis, and people with all big hearts and their best interests, they can't hang on to this for too long at once. It's too hard and it's too scary. And the culture, the regular old capitalist American culture, is shoving us in the other direction at every turn. So artists and other people who have the capacity need to really help keep us going on this trail of saving ourselves and figuring out what to do next. And I'm hoping that this book will have some effect on people to that end. So I think we should read a few more poems. And then, since no one is curious, I'm so startled. You can always find me on social media or possibly downtown drinking coffee if you need me. I'm going to read you a couple more poems, and then I'm not sure about the protocol of marketing on this particular Zoom call, but I will say that this book is available widely in the county. Bookstores, gift stores, even the famous aforementioned SPD market. And if there aren't any in the library yet, there soon will be. So you'll be able to take it out of any of the public libraries. This is called The Drought Happened by Junior Gutierrez, 5th grader from Selma Herndon Elementary School in Livingston. The drought happened. It stopped raining. The aquifers dried up. Since there was no water, there were no crops. And since no crops, no food. And no food, nothing to eat for animals, and nothing to eat for humans. Everyone was starving. The drought went on for many years. And this is a letter from fire by a local woman, girl, person, female person, who was in the 9th grade last year at Nevada Union High School in Grass Valley. A letter from fire by Ali Vandra. Sorry, I came out of nowhere and destroyed everything, like a typhoon against a stick house. I was just hungry. My hunger cannot be tamed, though. It's like the Yuba River in winter, rushing and rising over land, sweeping away anything in its wake. I want to be friends, but everything I touch turns to ash. I tried to warn you as my hunger ran wild. My bright red and orange lit up the sky like a warning siren going off. But still I was too quick. No warning could ever prepare you for my destruction. The wind tried to knock me down, and the lakes and rivers tried to surround me, but they did not avail. My hunger dismisses them as a slight annoyance in the whole scheme of things, and ravages your home, your family. Sorry, I cannot do anything but watch, as if I were a fawn witnessing her mother hit by a car, unable to stop it, unable to move. Sorry. And I'd like to end with this poem, Secrets, by Sophia Lee, last year a 5th grader at West Portal Elementary School in San Francisco. Secrets. The glistening white moon taught me how to sleep at night. The golden sun taught the world to rise during the bumpy dawn. The shaking forest has secrets to tell you. You are strong. Don't give up. You can make it through. Thank you for coming to my non-TED Talk, my local author talk. Thank you to the library, and thank you to the writers in this county who keep us all going. And that's all I have to say. Here comes Megan.
Thank you so much, Molly. That was marvelous. That was absolutely wonderful. We really enjoyed it. See, I'm not seeing any questions here on our YouTube, so I'm just going to make a couple of announcements. So this month is National Novel Writing Month. So for those of you who are interested in that, we have a special series going on with our regular Just My Type Writing Club. They're doing a series of programs on Mondays at 4. It's just themed around National Novel Writing Month. And this upcoming Monday, November 9th, they're going to be featuring local author Diane Covington Carter. And then coming up in December, we're going to do winter reading this year. So we've done our summer reading, and now we're going to do a little bit of winter reading, and it's a very chill challenge in all the ways that you can interpret that. And then finally, beginning in February 2021, we're doing Nevada County Reads and Writes, and that's going to be focusing on The Roundhouse by Louise Erdrich. So you can pick up that book at the library anytime you like. And of course, Molly's book that she's been talking about today. I did see a copy, although it did run off the shelf the second I put it out into our outdoor book browsing. So as soon as it's back, you're more than welcome to come and check it out, because it is quite an interesting book. But thank you so much, Molly. It really was an honor to have you with us today.
It was fun. Thanks so much. And everybody, get your library card and go to the library.